In this video, we're going to talk about AWS IAM and some of its core components. IAM is one of the most important security services in AWS and stands for Identity and Access Management. AWS IAM lets you securely control access to your AWS resources. You can use IAM to decide who can log in, what they're allowed to do, and which resources they can access in your AWS account. Instead of sharing one big master login with everyone, IAM lets you create separate identities and give each of them just the right amount of access. IAM centralizes identity and permissions for all AWS services and is deeply integrated with the platform, which makes managing and auditing access easier as your cloud usage grows. Now, to really understand how IAM works, let's start with the most powerful identity in your AWS account, the AWS Root User. The root user is the very first identity that gets created when you open an AWS account. It has full, unrestricted access to everything in that account, including things like closing the account completely. You should think of the root user like the master key to your entire environment. The best practice is secure it, protect it, and only use it for a few rare account-level tasks. Because it's so powerful, the next thing you should absolutely want to think about is how to protect it properly. One of the easiest and most effective ways to protect the root user, and not only the root user but any IAM user, is multi-factor authentication, or MFA. MFA means you don't just log in with a password. You also provide a second factor like a temporary code from your phone or your email, so even if someone steals your password, they still can't log in without that second factor. In IAM, you can require MFA for sensitive users to reduce the risk of account compromise and keep access tighter. Once you've locked down the root user with MFA, the next step is to give everyday access to the right people in a safer, more controlled way. The first core building block is IAM Users. IAM users represent individual people or sometimes applications that need long-term access to your AWS account. An IAM user has a name and can have a console password to log into the AWS Management Console and access keys, which include access key ID and secret access key for connecting via the CLI or SDK. By default, a new IAM user has no permissions at all. They can't do anything until you explicitly attach policies to them. The main benefit is clear accountability. Each person gets their own login, and you can track exactly who did what in that account. If someone leaves the company, you just disable or delete their user without affecting anyone else. Use IAM users mainly for real people who need regular access. Next, let's look at IAM Groups. An IAM group is simply a collection of users. You attach policies to the group, and every user in that group automatically gets those permissions. Groups themselves don't log in, they're just a way to manage permissions more easily and effectively. Instead of saying, give Bob, Alice, John S3 access, you create a developers group, for example, with S3 permissions and just add or remove users as needed. Typical examples include a read-only group that can view resources but not change anything, or a, for example, DevOps group that can manage EC2, RDS, and CloudWatch resources. Now, let's answer the how do we actually define permissions question. That's where IAM Policies come in. The IAM policy is a JSON document that defines which actions are allowed or denied, on which resources, and optionally under which conditions. If a policy does not allow an action, that action is not permitted. Policies gives you a very fine-grained control and help you follow the principle of least privilege that we talked about in previous videos. The principle of you only giving the exact permission needed to do the job and nothing extra to the targets. So far, we've been talking about permissions for specific users, but what if we want AWS services or even external identities to use permissions dynamically? And that's where roles come in. IAM role is similar to a user that it has permissions through policies, but it's not tied to a single person. Instead, a role is something that other identities or services can assume. When they assume the role, they temporarily become the role and get whatever permissions that the role has. Roles use temporary security credentials that are automatically rotated by AWS, which are so secure. So unlike long-lasting access keys on users, role credentials are short-lived and managed for you behind the scenes. AWS services like EC2, Lambda, or ECS can assume roles and access other services securely. And you can allow external identities like another AWS account, for example, to assume a role instead of creating separate users for them. A common example is an EC2 instance role that allows the application running on that instance to read and write from a specific S3 bucket. Now, switching gears a little bit. Since we're talking about how identities actually authenticate to AWS, let's talk a bit more about access keys and how to handle them safely. When IAM users connect through the AWS Management Console, they use a username and password, and when they connect through the CLI or SDK, they use access keys. Access keys are powerful, and if they're long-lived and not rotated, they become a big risk for you. If someone gets access to those keys, they can perform any action that the user is allowed to do. So some of the good practices here are avoid long-lasting access keys where possible, prefer using IAM roles and temporary credentials, and if you really have to use access keys, rotate them regularly and never hardcode them in source code or commit them to version control. Beyond the core IAM objects, AWS gives you some helpful tools to analyze and validate your permissions as well. For example, IAM Access Analyzer is a tool that looks for resources in your account that are shared externally, for example, a bucket that's open to another account or to the public, and alerts you about it, and it can also help validate policies and even suggest policies based on your actual usage. Or the other tool is IAM Policy Simulator that lets you test a policy before you rely on it. You can simulate a user or role and check whether a specific action on a specific resource would be allowed or denied. Now that you've seen the main building blocks and the supporting tools, let's quickly bring everything together. IAM is the core AWS service that controls who can access what in your account. You work with users for people, groups to manage sets of users, policies to define permissions, and roles for AWS services and external identities to assume securely. By default, users have no access. You explicitly grant permissions using policies, following list privilege as closely as you can. Wherever it makes sense, use MFA for important accounts and roles with temporary credentials instead of long-lasting access keys. With these fundamentals in place, you'll have a much more secure and manageable AWS environment. And that is it for this video, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video.